Print, email, Facebook, Twitter. More on the road to recovery with two brothers, a barber and their stories. Storytelling has long been a way of passing on culture and traditions, but for two indigenous men it has become a way of spreading the message that you can recover from devastating addiction and rebuild your life. Brought together by their addiction to drugs and alcohol, Steve Morris and Jeff Amato now stand side by side as a modern example of how powerful the simple act of talking can be, traveling across the country as brothers for recovery. We put ourselves in deep, dark places because we don't talk about our feelings, Mr. Amato said. He said men's inability to open up to one another was the #1 killer for us. We're not counselors, we're not psychiatrists. We're just storytellers, Mr. Morris said. Their aim is to inspire men to use those moments of sitting around chatting to mates to share struggles, ask for help and be supported. They speak from experience. Not even my own mob wanted anything to do with him for a long time. Mr. Amato saw his slide into drink, drugs and crime as inevitable. I trained my mind to think this is just the cards we're dealt, the 38-year-old said. He grew up in Wellington in central New South Wales, where it was normal to wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, 3 or 4 days out of the week, and see a lot of drinking and drug addiction around the table. Growing up I started to believe the life was normal. That's just what we do, he said. And so, he did. And his addictions grew. Heroin became his biggest vice and also something he could not afford. It came to a time in my late 20s where I started getting more desperate and I didn't care what I did to feed my habit, Mr. Amato said. I started doing jail a bit more, a lot more actually. When he wasn't inside, Mr. Amato fell easily into his old way of life. It was just a merry-go-round for a lot of years. Not even my own mob wanted anything to do with me, and no one could trust me. When his own mother told him he was no longer welcome, he knew something had to change, but he never expected rehab to make a difference. He only agreed to a stint at the Glen, a rehabilitation center for men on the NSW Central Coast, to avoid going back to jail, but it transformed him. I believe something watched over me in that rehab, sitting around the fire with other indigenous men yarning and talking, Mr. Amato said. I put my hand up for another 3 months. I said I don't want to go home. Mr. Amato said at first being sober was a daily struggle, but he has not touched drink or drugs for 8 years. For a long time he couldn't return home, but now he says, I'm stronger. I started thieving from mates. Steve Morris drank heavily for 10 years, but alcohol was just the start of it. Party, drugs, gambling and finally ice became all-consuming. It's not something I'm proud of saying, but I started thieving from mates, Mr. Morris said. That's what it did to me. And I hate it. I regret it. I could use ice every day, but because the bloke around the corner used it more, I thought I didn't need help. Then came a relationship and 2 young children, and a realization one morning as his partner stepped over him lying on the floor that he had a serious problem. Steve Morris knew Jeff Amato and reached out to the older man. Mr. Amato became his rock, and a friendship blossomed as Mr. Morris began a new life at the age of 28. My friends that I've got today, they don't drink, they don't drug and they don't gamble, and they're the choices I've got to make, Mr. Morris said. They're hard some days. I'm not ashamed to say I use Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. A roadshow with a simple message, talk out of the bond between the two men, Brothers for Recovery was born, a kind of oral history roadshow. Over the past year, the men have notched up about 15,000 kilometers, turning up at schools, community centers and prisons with what they hope are inspirational stories of addiction and rehabilitation. Lately, the brothers have been joined on their travels by the Boomerang Barber, a young man from Wellington who said he was inspired to get clean after hearing their stories. Corey Sutherland, 26, offers haircuts to men coming to hear the talks, some of whom he said had never paid for a barber's visit. Just gives everyone a good fresh look, he said. Helps their self-esteem and builds them up, instead of knocking them down. The trio accept that they are only scratching the surface of a huge problem, but think they're making a difference. Because people have followed us, people have followed our track, and they are starting to put their hand up for help, Mr. Amato said. Print, email, Facebook, Twitter.